Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a special COP27 edition of This Is CDR. This is CDR. It's an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals OpenAir seeks to advance at every level of government in the U.S., as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. My name's Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York. If you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself in the chat. I work on carbon removal policy advocacy and market development with OpenAir. If you're not familiar with OpenAir, we're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon removal solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. We work together on shared open source missions, member-driven in the areas of policy advocacy, research and development, messaging and communications, and activist CDR market development. There should be a link in the chat. Megha just put a link in the chat to a forum where you can sign up to join us. We have lots of work to do and would love to have you be a part of what we're doing. As always, before we get started, we like to define our terms here. This is a definition of carbon removal from the CDR primer, which I happen to have my own copy of right here, and we'll put a link in the chat where you can order your own hard copy, which I encourage you to do. Carbon removal is purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. There are two really important things to call out whenever we talk about CDR. Number one, carbon removal is different from what is typically called carbon capture. Carbon capture typically means point source carbon capture, meaning capturing CO2 from an emission source, whether it's a natural gas power plant or a cement plant. This may or may not be a good climate solution, depending on the specific techno-economic situation and socioeconomic situation. But one thing it's definitely not is carbon removal, which is, again, removing CO2 from the atmosphere, a purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Number two, whenever we talk about carbon removal, it's really important to call out up front that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form a substitute for reducing emissions. We need to reduce emissions and decarbonize our global economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that carbon removal will also be required to stabilize our climate at gigaton scale by mid-century. That's billions of tons per year to abate emissions that we're not going to be able to eliminate or reduce in a climate relevant time frame, specifically from agriculture, for example. And additionally, in the second half of the century, we have trillions of tons of anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere already, and we're going to be removing those. So we're going to need to scale carbon removal from its current kiloton scale to gigaton scale by mid-century, and that means we have to get to work. And that carbon removal is an essential climate solution alongside emissions reduction and also adapting to our already changed climate. We're going to learn a lot more about that today from our very exciting guest, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Megha Raghavan to talk a little bit about run of show and to introduce today's session.
Thanks, Toby. Hi, everyone. I'm Megha. I am a member of OpenAir, and I work on policy advocacy on carbon removal all around the world. Just the usual housekeeping notes to start. So our format will be a short presentation followed by a few prepared questions and then moderated audience Q&A. So as we go along, please type any questions that you might have for our presenter into the Q&A box, and just make sure you find the one labeled Q&A, since that will help us sort of organize them better than if you put them in the chat box. The event is being recorded, so we will send that video link out to everyone who registered. We'll also post it to OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel. And today is also a special COP27 episode of This Is CDR, like Toby said. So we will also have this episode on the Carbon Removals at COP27 website. So you can find that at carbonremovals.org. I think Toby will put a link in the chat to that. And there's also lots of other great CDR related content on there and information on all things CDR at COP this year. So this week on This Is CDR, we're really thrilled to welcome Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Dr. Jennifer Wilcox of the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, or FECM, to tell us about her work leading FECM and what's next for the advancement, deployment, and scaling of CDR in the U.S. A little bit about Dr. Wilcox. Jennifer Wilcox is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at DOE, and is on leave as the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition, as a Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, or WRI, she led WRI's carbon removal program. Having grown up in rural Maine, Dr. Wilcox has a profound respect and appreciation of nature. That appreciation permeates her work, and she focuses on minimizing climate and environmental impacts of our dependence on fossil fuels. Dr. Wilcox holds a PhD in chemical engineering and an MA in chemistry from the University of Arizona, as well as a BA in mathematics from Wellesley College. Dr. Wilcox's research takes aim at the nexus of energy and the environment, developing both mitigation and adaptation strategies to minimize negative climate impacts associated with society's dependence on fossil fuels. She served on committees of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Physical Society to assess carbon capture methods and impacts on climate. She is the author of the first textbook on carbon capture, called Carbon Capture, published in March 2012, and she co-edited the CDR primer on carbon dioxide removal in 2021. So now over to the main event. Dr. Wilcox, whenever you're ready, it's over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to share the work that we're doing at the Department of Energy and a little bit of my background here too as well. So getting started here, I wanted to, and I apologize, I'm in a room, and so it's a little bit dark in the background, but hopefully you can see me okay. I wanted to start by looking at this representative pathway to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, the current significant climate goal in the United States today. And so what you see on the right-hand side is all of the different mitigation approaches to be able to achieve net zero in time, and then also recognizing that it's going to be critical for us to have carbon removal at scale in time in order to counterbalance the hard to decarbonize sectors. And that's really a big part of what I want to talk about too, is just the role of carbon removal and how it's there to counterbalance, not offsetting. So it's not there to offset emissions that we have technologies to decarbonize or avoid emissions in the first place. It's really there to counterbalance. These are sectors like agriculture, or even parts of the transportation sector today, like aviation, long-haul shipping, or long-haul trucking or shipping. And so really thinking responsibly about carbon removal. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a political appointee in the Biden administration, and I started on January 20th in the administration. And really looking at overseeing the efforts in Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And what we've done in the first year is we actually did a complete reorganization of our office and flipped the mission upside down. And so what we're looking at is really investing in approaches, technologies, and research that really minimizes our impacts on the production of fossil fuels and how we use fossil fuels. And that includes the accumulated emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere, where carbon dioxide removal starts to play a role. And then also in terms of our updated vision of our office, really looking at our investments so that they align with the administration's goals, 50% emissions reduction by 2030, CO2 emissions free power by 2035, and net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. If you're interested in learning more about our effort, our reorganization, and then the strategic vision that we developed that's coupled to it, you can take a look at it on our website under resources under FECM DOE. Wanted to talk a little bit about my background and how I got into this space of carbon removal. It really started back in 2008, where I was a co-author on a report from the American Physical Society that was looking at what's the cost if we're to do, say, direct air capture using chemicals. What would the cost look like? And really looking at the technical feasibility of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere using chemicals. And so at that time, I was part of a larger group that you can see here, and we released this report. It took 3 years, so we released it in 2011. At that time, I was also an assistant professor at Stanford, and I was teaching carbon capture and storage and recognizing that, and when I was teaching my students, that there wasn't a good book or tool to be able to help in the classroom. And so I recognized that gap, and so spent also that time developing a textbook on carbon capture. And it's not just carbon capture from point sources like cement facilities or power plants, but it's also, there's a thread of direct air capture throughout the entire textbook to really show the distinction between these two critical tools, avoiding emissions from entering the atmosphere to begin with, from more concentrated sources, versus taking CO2 from the accumulated pool in the atmosphere. And that accumulated pool of CO2, it's very dilute by comparison. It requires different types of processes. And so really looking at the difference between those tools throughout. And then in 2015 and in 2019, a part of these two National Academy of Sciences reports, where the first one is really looking at, what are the tools for carbon removal and seeing this as a means of intervening with climate change. And two reports were published at that time, one associated with carbon removal, which was one knob of being able to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the other one was associated with the reflectivity of the earth and albedo modification, and both under the umbrella of climate intervention. And then in 2019, very different, although still on carbon removal, but it was more about, okay, now how can we actually provide a blueprint for the federal government to be able to start to think about the investments in this space in order for us to get to that kiloton scale today, and then up to gigatons that are going to be required just to counterbalance the hard to decarbonize sectors. We're going to need gigatons by mid-century. So how do we do that scale up? And then how can the government play a role in terms of the investments all across government? Department of Energy just being one agency, but Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of the Interior, where there's USGS, the Department of Agriculture, NOAA, like all across different agencies, a whole of government, an integrated approach to invest in the portfolio is what the report really was presenting, is that blueprint. And at that time, also recognizing that there really needed to be a place for that R&D in the work to be published. And so we launched a new journal on carbon removal that's under the framework of Frontiers Open Access. And so that's a wonderful resource if you'd like to, think about where can you publish your work in the space as you're starting to do research. And then finally, recognizing too that there wasn't a book specifically on carbon removal, and that we also want to make sure we tease this out as a separate tool compared to point source capture. And recognizing too that there was a new generation of young thinkers in this space who wanted to have a role in climate, and thinking about carbon removal as kind of the next space race, of getting young people excited and really being able to take their skill set and apply it in a way that can really help have an impact and ultimately help us to get this tool to scale so it can be part of our kit in time to achieve net zero. So the carbon removal, and Toby talked about that and has a hard copy, which is great. So that's another excellent resource for you to take a look at. At the start of our strategic vision that FECM published back in April, I wanted to also show this calculation, and you can, again, take a look at the strategic vision to learn more. But it's that bottom-up calculation. It's about thinking about the scale of carbon removal, which is still gigatons, but still thinking about it in a responsible way. And so when you do the bottom-up calculation of what are the truly hard to decarbonize sectors today, what don't we have the tools today in order to avoid emissions, you start to look at these sectors, and in the United States, they still add up to on the order of a gigaton. And in order to achieve net zero, the emissions we put in the atmosphere, we have to be able to take back out. Recognizing that also there are nature-based approaches that are natural sinks at the expense of ocean acidification. The terrestrial biosphere are uptaking roughly half of our global emissions every year, but again, at the expense of ocean acidification. We're also seeing a lot of those sinks, as we see increased warming, we're seeing a lot of the sinks become sources of emissions. And so the role that carbon removal will play, we can't necessarily depend on all of those natural sinks to be able to get us to net zero. It's going to be a critical technology for us, but we need to think about it in a responsible way. In the carbon removal primer, you can also kind of, see in chapter 1, and this is really showing that scale again of really recognizing that we have to invest in prioritizing deep decarbonization as fast as possible. But in the meantime, recognizing that we have to go from kilotons to gigatons, that we have to be able to also be investing in scaling up carbon removal. We need to do these things in parallel. Again, going back to the National Academy of Sciences study, that was also serving as the framework. So exactly a year ago, we launched the carbon negative shot at COP last year. And what this is looking at is all approaches to carbon removal. And really looking at investing R&D across this broad range of portfolio so that as we start to scale, as we start to learn by doing and moving down the cost curve, how can we get it so that these investments can lead to durable scale, durable storage and scale at $100 per ton? And so the carbon negative shot is a whole wide DOE effort, not just FECM, where we're really investing in a broad portfolio of solutions. I'll also say, when you think about a lot of the incentives today for scaling up direct air capture, there's a lot of attention. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But there's the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's the bump up in 45Q, in addition to that, through the Inflation Reduction Act. And some might say, but what about these other approaches? But the reality is when you look at the monitoring and the reporting and verification, when you look at direct air capture coupled to geologic storage, we inherently have the MRV in place because we are doing geologic storage in the United States through permitting Class 6 wells, which are coupled to MRV. So part of the carbon negative shot is investing in the other approaches such that they can be just as quantifiable as direct air capture. So that's kind of the key with that. And I can talk more about that too, if it comes up in the Q&A. But the other piece that I wanted to point out is how we invest in FECM across direct air capture in particular. So all the way from materials research to putting materials in a process, which is really the coupling to mechanical and chemical engineering. And so it's not just about materials design in the lab, but it's how those actual materials are functioning in a larger process. What's the pressure drop? What's the energy or the power required to overcome pressure drop in a system? What is the thermal energy required for heat of regeneration? Or can you use electricity for regeneration? All of those pieces that actually are integrated into the process at that larger scale are also investments that we're making to try and push these technologies from lower technological readiness level all the way up to the demonstration scale. The other thing that's important to recognize here is that as we really start to demonstrate direct air capture at scale, what we learn at the demonstration phase is also going to ultimately feed back into the R&D. We need to be able to understand what are the parts of the system that fail over years of operation. A lot of times when we think about direct air capture and it's so dilute, if you're using a solvent, you have to use a very, very strong base to do the capture. Maybe it's potassium hydroxide. When you think about solid sorbents, you can use a weaker base, because you have a higher coverage of chemistry across the surface. And that weaker base still is corrosive. So we really have to be able to understand the materials challenges over time. We have to be able to understand end of life of the materials, whether or not we have to recycle them or can we recharge them and bring them back into the system. So only until we really get these demonstrations out in the field in realistic environments of climate will we be able to then feed that back into more R&D investments. And so that's going to be a critical component as well. I want to just take a moment too to talk about the recent legislation that's passed. So we have two key pieces of legislation. And I really do believe that we wouldn't be able to scale up direct air capture or carbon removal more broadly if it wasn't for the fact that we have the two. So there's the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is really building out the first of a kind capital. And so the $12 billion is associated with all carbon management across FECM, specifically for direct air capture. There's $3.5 billion. Also want to recognize, though, as we take CO2 out of the atmosphere, you have to be able to also put it into the earth if it's to truly be carbon removal, or you have to store it in a long-lived product if you want it to be durable carbon removal. And so in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's also $2.5 billion associated with storage and validation. And so that's really important to recognize that we're building out the capacity to put CO2 underground, also building out the capacity to do the direct air capture. And really seeing these first of a kind hubs and projects as creating gold standards that the private sector can use as an example to go by. Because the next piece of legislation is the Inflation Reduction Act. Specifically for direct air capture, it's been bumped up to $180 per ton of CO2. And really what we're seeing here is that the government and the investment in the first of a kind costly demonstrations will help by learning by doing and moving down the cost curve. But it's really that second piece. It's really the Inflation Reduction Act and providing this economic incentive through the federal tax credit so that the private sector can get us to the nth of a kind, and then ultimately get us to the scale required to achieve net zero. It's also important to recognize that not just direct air capture hubs, but also just all the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, there's an important element for applications, and that's having a community benefits plan. And so every application requires a community benefits plan. And when you look at the whole weighting of the application, the community benefits plan is 20%. It has to have 4 critical pieces. One is a community and stakeholder engagement. Another is diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility. Justice 40 initiative, which means the investments need to lead to benefits, and 40% need to go to disadvantaged communities. And then a 4th element associated with quality jobs. And so if you want to learn more, you can take a look at the resources on our website, on FECM's website, and there's the link below as well. A lot of what we're doing too is just recognizing the stakeholder engagement, community engagement that needs to take place associated with the geologic storage of CO2. And that's something that I've been working hard with our colleagues at the Environmental Protection Agency, and really being very clear that the Department of Energy has been investing over 20 years so that we have the tools to ultimately get ahead of the risks associated with the injection of CO2 deep underground. And through the Recovery Act funding previously, we have 3 significant demonstrations that were successful. And ultimately, through those 3 significant demonstrations, we were able to show 12 million tons of CO2 permanently removed, and that's since 2013. And so it's really critical that we do this work in terms of communicating to communities the risks and being transparent about the risks, but also that we have the tools and that we have the framework. Even when dollars are going out the door associated with geologic storage, there's a 4-phase process where we can actually have go, no-go decisions. And so that's really an important element. To also drive home a little bit more, this is the Petronova project that was funded through the Recovery Act funding. And so the technology that was used here is a solvent-based approach. And, really when we first invented this approach, it was back in 1930, and that we were using really for CO2 separations that we use for the food and beverage industry. And it's that same technology that we were able to scale up to do this project. And you look at this tower, and it's 115 meters tall. And as you think about how we capture carbon here, your gas is going into the bottom. It's being, usually blowers or fans are pushing it through a liquid that's pumped down packing material. And really what you're trying to achieve is an intimate contact between the gas and the liquid. And so the CO2 in the gas phase will go through that interface, find the chemistry, chemically bind. And the idea at the end is the gas, the higher the column, the gas is coming out clean. And as you move the liquid down, it's coming out saturated in CO2. And so you can imagine an infinite tower, you could capture all the CO2, but that scales with costs. And so this is what it looks like when you have a more concentrated stream, say from a power plant, or it could be from a cement plant. Now, if you look at direct air capture, it's quite different. You have these, very deep beds, but they're narrow in terms of where you're looking at the fan power to overcome pressure drop. And we're looking at different technologies. It could be liquid solvents, it could be solid sorbents. And remember, solid sorbents, if you take just a gram of a solid sorbent, it has the surface area of a football field, which is why you can get away with using, say, weaker bases like amines, which then, have the benefit of just lower heats of regeneration in terms of driving the chemistry back off the CO2. but we're still at a point where we need to figure out how to scale these materials up. Resolvents, we can make them at scale, but come with their own challenges. And so when you look at capturing the equivalent CO2, if you look at capturing 1 million tons of CO2 per year with direct air capture, you need roughly 10 of these contactors compared to the equivalent CO2 from a point source where you need 2. And so these are just very, very different tools. They require different capital, different types of technology, different energy needs. And it's really important to see these as different tools at the end of the day. And as we're looking at advancing and accelerating carbon management, you can see again, $12 billion across all carbon management grants, loans, credits, and what we're expected to build out with that. The 4 direct air capture hubs I talked about, but 100 plus new dedicated CO2 storage wells. We're expected to potentially double the pipelines of CO2 in the United States. We have roughly 5,000 miles today, expecting to double that. And so with that, these are some resources that I urge you to take a look at if you're interested in learning more about what we're doing in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. The justice and engagement work is there, and also a link to our strategic vision. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. That was a fantastic overview of all the amazing work that's happening at FECM. And I just want to, first of all, on OpenAir's behalf, thank you for all of that, and also for assembling such an amazing team. I mean, the people that you've brought in are such high caliber and really, I think, are thinking about carbon removal in the correct way, and that really manifests in all of your work. So thank you. You covered a couple of our prepared questions. I want to dig in a little bit further into the idea of method neutral carbon removal policy. You talked about how the carbon negative shots are largely method neutral, but a couple of policies are not. For example, 45Q, and then also obviously the DAC hubs. Can you talk about the rationale for that, and why, for example, 45Q excludes other capture methods, and other sequestration methods, for example, mineralization, in favor of Class 6 wells? And similarly, I guess the DAC hubs. Just what are your thoughts on that, and why would it make sense to exclude certain methods from certain policies, as opposed to having an overall method neutral policy that just lets different methods compete to see which one will do the best job?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And so when you look at 45Q, there's 2 elements. So there's the US Treasury and the carbon accounting. So our office gets to really be supportive in terms of providing technical expertise for the carbon accounting for 45Q. But then, when you look at that and you look at 45Q, the pathway that we're interested in probably talking about today is that when you couple either carbon capture or direct air capture with geologic storage. And geologic storage, when you're coupling to dedicated geologic storage, that has to be permitted through a Class 6 well, through the Environmental Protection Agency, through EPA. And within that process, that Class 6 permitting process, it's embedded within the process monitoring, reporting, and verification, MRV, associated with the carbon that's injected deep underground, to show where the CO2 plume is, to understand, making sure it doesn't, go into groundwater, making sure there's not induced seismicity. And so there's the framework through EPA in place for dedicated storage. And so because that MRV exists in order to safely keep the CO2 underground, and you look at, now let's broaden it, and you look at other approaches associated with carbon removal, with oceans, for instance. Could there be a day where we have a 45Q for storage carbon or storing carbon in oceans? Could there be a similar provision in the legislation that provides, infrastructure funding like the DAC hubs for ocean storage? But I think first we need to be able to understand and get some good projects out there at the R&D stage of what are the tools that we're using to quantify the carbon that's removed in a system like that. We have to be able to understand, well, what are the risks associated with the re-release of CO2 in the ocean? And what are the potential environmental impacts of that, or ecosystem impacts? And so I think it's really important that those that are doing research in that space be able to be very transparent about the measurements, the tools that they're using to quantify the carbon that's removed. And that's oceans. And I get a little nervous, right? Because the unintended consequences are significant. Now you take something that maybe feels a little bit safer, take a forest, and so you take a forest today and it's like, well, what are the tools that we have in place that actually show the actions that you're doing through improved forest management are resulting in additional carbon removal in that system? And then to be able to show it again in a transparent, quantitative way, and then also to somehow be able to show that you can do it for, say, 100 plus years, and what does that look like? To me, the nature-based approaches start to look engineered when you actually look at all of the control that needs to take place and the equipment that needs to be in place and the standardization. And so I think this is critical, and it's a gap across the other approaches that doesn't exist in using chemicals to take carbon out of the atmosphere coupled to geologic storage through that EPA Class 6 permit. So what I'll just say, one last bit, is we absolutely hear the communities out there that, hey, we'd like a 45Q, and we'd like another, like Oceans Hub or whatever you want to call it, like that'd be great. But what we need first is the MRV in place. And so what we see the gap. So one of the things that you might have saw I think it was just last week, it was on the 7th, we have a notice of intent that went out. We're calling upon the national labs to help, to assemble teams, to work with companies, across the broad spectrum, to be able to really figure out what are the standards that could be used across the broad approaches. And then how can we do data sharing? How can we be transparent? How can we enable many to be able to use those same kind of guidelines and to agree as a community?
Got it. That's really helpful. And thank you for such a exhaustive and well thought out answer. I definitely want to get to MRV because it's such a hot topic in the sector. Just one follow up on the actual geologic storage. What's the rationale for requiring Class 6 permitted wells as opposed to, for example, a mineralization process like carb fix?
Sure. So Class 6 is for saline storage. And so it's all aligned for that. Class 2, for instance, is like for enhanced oil recovery. So that's a different classification. We don't have a classification for mineralization. And so we have one project in the United States where we looked at mineralization. This was the Wallula project in Washington State. And that was a Class 5. So that's more of like experimental. And so the question is, do we have to develop a brand new classification for mineralization, and my feeling is that because these types of rocks, whether it's basalts or whether it's peridotite or other, mafic and ultramafic formations that contain magnesium that can react with CO2 and mineralize it on a timescale of less than 2 years, like Carbfix, they're all a little different. And so the risks are different, right? And so to me, it's still R&D when the rocks are all different, and so it's also because it's feels like more R&D, it's probably going to go through but this is still, not completely clear, but still probably similar to the Wallula project in Washington State, because that's our example to go by, is probably like the experimental Class 5, permit.
Got it. Thank you. And there may be some follow-up. There are a lot of practitioners, I believe, in the audience who have put questions on some of these specific points in the audience Q&A. We have a ton of audience questions, so I want to wrap up the prepared questions. Just two more quick things. I put a link to the recent MRV NOI, as we like to call them, Notice of Intent, right? And there's been a lot of work and discussion across the sector recently about MRV. So it's super exciting to see FECM get involved in such a proactive way. Can you talk about what a hopeful vision is for establishing a set of standards across these disparate carbon removal methods, both even at a national level, but then also like reconciling standards supranationally so we don't have one whatever mineralization standard in the US and another one in the EU? Like how do you see that happening in a hopeful way, and over maybe what hopeful time period? Like how long do you see that taking?
Sure. I mean, one thing I'll say is that I think it's on Thursday this week where the Secretary of Energy will be talking about CDR Launchpad effort, where we're talking about really bringing in more than, and I'm talking from the international perspective first here. And so really looking at not just the United States, but bringing partnerships together, Canada, hopefully Norway, the UK, Europe, Japan, these other regions that are also recognizing the critical need for carbon removal as a tool to get and achieve net zero, that if we can work together across an understanding of consistency in terms of MRV. And I wouldn't say that there's, at the end of the day, my hope is going to be a standardization across the different approaches. I'm not sure that that's the right answer, to be honest, because I think that they're all so unique, the different approaches. And I don't know if it's needed, because one thing I'll say too is when you look at direct air capture coupled to geologic storage, those types of rocks, whether, it's the porous media that we have depleted oil and gas or saline aquifers or ultramafics, and things like that. It's not all regions on the globe have access to those types of rocks, but maybe they have access to other types of removals, like improved carbon storage in soils or in forests. And so I think we do have to tackle each one on its own, figure out what the MRV looks like. And that's my hope, is that we can really look at each one and really try to work with the nations too, that removal approach is appropriate for their region, and doing everything we can so that there are going to be regions that don't actually contribute much to greenhouse gases, but have a lot to offer in terms of carbon removal. And some of these approaches have such significant ecosystem benefits. It could mean, in terms of improved farming and less greenhouse gas emissions because you're not fertilizing as much, right? It could mean helping to de-risk forest fires through improved forest management. It could mean reduced ocean acidification if you're doing an approach like adding alkalinity to oceans. So like the ecosystem benefits are extremely significant. And anyway, my hope at the end of the day is that we can kind of figure these out, but not try to force all of them to have some standard framework, but really just recognizing each one, at least as a start.
Right. So each one has to have a standard framework, but we don't need one standard framework to apply to every method.
Some will argue with that. And I'm still in flux, because like if somebody comes along with some great idea, I'm absolutely flexible.
Yeah. And just one quick follow-up there. Do you see in an ideal world these standards being administered by governments, by like an independent body like an ISO? Like obviously I don't think it's a great idea for the actual sector to just completely regulate itself. Like how do you see what is the ideal framework for kind of administering standards across the sector?
Yeah, so I don't have a good answer for that. I think there's a lot of ideas out there. I'm still kind of thinking about this myself, but I know as a start, what we're trying to do is first figure out what those standards look like. Like, let's define them and let's have a common framework within each approach. And that's what we're hoping to achieve with leveraging the labs and getting the labs to work with companies. And then maybe as part of that too, could envision, if there is, a group out there that's looking to be a verifier, it would be wonderful for those folks to be engaging with these efforts too, because we all need to work in this ecosystem together. It's not clear to me what that third party looks like at this stage. But I do think, at least the labs have the technical expertise. And there's not going to be one thing with the mechanism and the vehicle that we're putting out there for funding the labs is it's called it's Technology Commercialization Fund, and typically requires a cost share. In the first phase, we're actually looking to waive the cost share because we don't want there to be a conflict of interest. We really want the labs to just be going in and providing that assistance, to get the companies, the MRV in place without the conflict.
Thank you for talking about that. One last quick question, and then we want to get to the audience questions. I know that we are not supposed to pick favorites among our children, but maybe let's talk about the future a little bit. Are there any kind of frontiers of carbon removal that you personally find particularly exciting besides these sort of established direct air capture and other approaches that maybe are more established, like something that maybe the audience might not know that much about that you think has a lot of potential, that would be a great area that's kind of underexplored, maybe?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm not going to pick a favorite, but I'm going to answer it is in how you just described it. And that is underexplored. You know, I think oftentimes, well, there's two parts of this. One, underexplored, and there are companies out there that are doing this, but I do think it's interesting to look at approaches that you can do the regeneration of the material with electrons and not necessarily heat. You know, I do think that that's pretty interesting because then you don't have to worry about, you can turn these systems off and on, you know, and you don't have to think about if you're going with renewables and battery storage, because, you know, you've got to be able to keep these things running 24/7. And I think that, you know, that's kind of interesting, is looking at those approaches and kind of figuring some of that out to couple better with intermittent low carbon energy. And I do think that's a bit underexplored. Everything today is a lot of thermal driven processes. And then the other piece I think that I get excited about is, you know, because everybody wants to do the back of the envelope calculation of, oh my gosh, this is the energy. And if I multiply times a gigaton, it's like 30%, you know, it drives me crazy. I do the calculation too. It's in chapter 1 of the primer. I get it. We have to do that calculation. But I think it's also interesting, like, I get excited when you look at what we can do with the solid sorbents, and it's not necessarily solid sorbents win or anything like that, but the surface area of these materials. So the fact that you can get away with a weak base, you know, because you can cover the entire, again, a gram is like, you know, the surface area of a football field. And so just being able to, it's not a cheat, but getting away with using something that's weak in terms of binding, because CO2 is so dilute in the atmosphere. And it's like most of the molecules your material interacts with is nitrogen, you know, and those aren't the interesting ones. The CO2 is the interesting. And so I think trying to be a little bit creative there. And then finally, with that creativity, recognizing is that some of the work in terms of mineralization, I think, is interesting, because with mineralization, and not necessarily in situ, but maybe ex situ, you know, where you have some alkaline feedstocks, if you can find them or access them, is that it's not clear that you need to actually take the CO2 to 99% purity. What if you only had to take it to 20% purity? The energy required to go from 415 ppm, you know, to 20% is really different than 99% to condense it, put it in a pipeline and move it. And so, like, understanding CO2 as a reactive feedstock and whatever it's going to react with, and recognizing you may not need to go so high purity can save you some energy at the end of the day. I like that. I like to get, thinking about that too.
I think that's a really good point. I have so many more questions I want to ask you about synthetic biology, but we need to let the audience ask some questions. So I'm going to stop talking and let Megha come on and ask you some audience questions. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Perfect. Yeah. And I'm going to start with one, which we did get a couple of questions on this from the audience, but this is also very much one that I'm interested in, and the OpenAir community as well, which is just yesterday, there were a couple of big announcements at the state level on some carbon removal support policies. California announced the Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act, and Massachusetts had the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. We also, on This Is CDR a few weeks ago, had the Four Corners Coalition, which is supporting carbon dioxide removal at the local level, and finding ways to sort of, support that, share best practices and knowledge, putting together some grants. So there's a lot of stuff happening at the state and local level. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about those things, and how does that fit into what's happening at the national level and the work that you're primarily involved with?
Yeah, no, I think it would be, right now, I don't feel too connected to all of that, and it would be wonderful to know more about it, because to me, what a way to really accelerate progress. And so I think that number one, it's fantastic that there's so much energy in this space right now. And I also love that, Megha, you're talking about carbon removal, not just direct air capture. And I think that, again, because it goes to ecosystem benefits, and that there's this big question of like this tool, what's it going to do for me? And it's not, of course, we're seeing it as a climate tool. We need it to help us with our climate goals. But really that translation of starting in some communities with the ecosystem benefits is a good way to gain some traction. And so I would love to learn more about those efforts that are happening on the ground and really try to leverage them, So, and a lot of what we're trying to do too in FECM is just more stakeholder engagement, more broader communications. One thing that I would love, and maybe this is a call for action, since we've got a bunch of folks on here, is, I recognized this question a year ago, when our work was kind of getting more public from the government side, of like a pushback of like, there's no benefits associated with direct air capture. What are the benefits?
Right.
And, part of it is not really understanding what it is. What is carbon removal? What is direct air capture? What are these technologies? What do they look like? And I'm a teacher, right? And that's my background. And I feel like there's such an opportunity. And so, companies like Climeworks, companies like Carbon Engineering, Heirloom, the list goes on. I think it's really important, and it would be wonderful if there's more like video, more communications about what the technology is actually doing, how is it operating, and being really communicating that in a broader way. Like if you're doing something and you're getting to thousands of tons of removal, be able to create a short film on that, teach the broader community, because I'll just tell you, the folks that were pushing back on there's no benefits here are also folks that don't have a clue of like what this looks like and what it means. And so we need more of that. And I'm like ready to create a field trip, with really folks that we need them on the ground, seeing this work in action and feeling good about it. But guess what? The movement is so fast that when I knock on the doors of the folks that are building, they're like, we can't stop our process to bring your team in. And it's like, well, that's awesome. But they say, but we can take videos. We can do like, video tours. And it's like anything, because this stuff, if it's not something tangible to communities, it's going to be really hard to be able to say, oh yeah, trust us. There's no risks, and there's benefits. So we really need to do better about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's kind of partly what we hope to do with these. And yeah, definitely a big part of what needs to happen to get there. Yeah, I mean, maybe going off of that, we've got quite a few questions about sort of exactly that, like what does it take to get there? And you mentioned obviously education and getting people to understand things more. What else do you see as the big gaps? And people mentioned supply chain, policy, technology, all sorts of things. Like where do you see the biggest issues to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about them a little bit. I do think, we talk about technology risk more specifically with like direct air capture. But I think too, there's a social risk. And I think it's really critical. I know we've mentioned it, but I can't mention it enough, I guess, is that we need to really be able to understand not just technology barriers, but what are the social barriers to be able to really do this, and recognizing that as we demonstrate technologies, as we do this work, it's going to be happening in people's backyards, and that I think some of the work that you talked about with the states, getting communities to be part of the ownership would be amazing too. And I think that that's kind of an exciting idea to think about. To me, it feels a little easier with some of the nature-based solutions, like some of the agricultural processes, for instance, almost thinking like a cooperative, and it's like, if there's a federal tax credit, how about some of that coming back to the community? Like how can we have investments that truly lead to benefits and helping to kind of bring that back?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the co-benefits are obviously different depending on exactly what you're doing. And I think you kind of touched on this where I was talking about carbon removals more broadly and not DAC. What do you think at DOE about all the different forms of carbon removal out there, and the potential benefits, co-benefits that some of them might have? Is DAC really the focus, or is there potentially a broader portfolio that you're looking at supporting?
Yeah, so definitely a broader portfolio, and that's the nature of our carbon negative shot. And and also just recognizing, though, when we look, it's across DOE, it's not just FECM, it's EERE, it's the Office of Science, it's ARPA-E, it's a broad effort across all of DOE. And what we've got right now in our annual appropriations, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. It's wonderful, but it's actually not enough. So we have the hubs, we have 45Q already, the support in place, the policy levers, and the first of a kind infrastructure build out for DAC, right? For direct air capture, coupled to geologic storage. We need those same policies in place for all these this whole portfolio. We talk about the risks of forests being sinks today becoming sources. A significant co-benefit or ecosystem benefit of improved forest management is actually de-risking that.
Yeah.
And so we need to, and it's like, and you look at the voluntary market a little bit and say, oh, we're only going to invest in the robust approaches today, right? Because those are the ones we can count on. It's like, we need the other ones to count on too. We need the other ones to be able to be robust, just as robust. And there's an opportunity, I think, because there's still a lot of dollars invested in the nature-based offsets, right? And so to me, it's like, okay, let's look at all of that. And imagine if we were to just be able to bring those up, and make them more durable and make them more rigorous. I think it would be, really significant. And so the carbon negative shot is a start, but it really is just that, because those dollars are not enough for us to get all of those approaches, like the oceans, like the forests, like the soils. We need to rise them all up in terms of the rigor and the quantification that the DAC chemical engineering approach has, coupled to the geologic storage with its embedded MRV.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what's your sense, if we say by 2050, 2045, we want to have these technologies, one of them or a portfolio of them addressing residual emissions and kind of getting us to something closer to net zero. Do you see it as, we're kind of at a point now where there's lots of nascent things out there. We don't really know what's going to scale, what's going to work economically. How do you think about, like, how long do we just try lots of different things, see what works, and then at what point do we think about coalescing around something? Or do you think it's going to remain a portfolio in the longer term?
I mean, if we are investing as we're talking now across all of these approaches and recognizing globally that not everybody has the best rocks, and so in recognizing that it's not just about the United States, and that, we all live in the same greenhouse, and that if we can be a leader in making all of the portfolio robust across all the different approaches, then it's going to be a portfolio that other nations can leverage the framework that we help to create, and then ultimately, bring value in the ecosystem benefits to those nations too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we talked a bit about the sort of capture side of things. We did get quite a few questions on the storage side as well. And I think, the storage side of things is quite complicated. The permitting can be complicated. Is the US kind of similar to other countries in terms of the available storage? Like, do other countries also have significant storage potential? And how does the permitting and sort of, I guess, ease of actually using that storage compare globally?
Sure. And I'll just emphasize that there's a beautiful mapping chapter in the carbon removal primer. And so all of this is outlined, and the Global Carbon Capture Storage Institute has a lot of this information there too that you can take a look at. But there are other, definitely other regions that you see a lot of the more point source capture, opportunities coupled to geologic storage. And globally, there's efforts in Australia, there's significant efforts in Norway. Of course, we see Iceland. And so there are, efforts in terms of geologic storage in other regions, but then there's also parts of the globe where there's oil and gas production but not really thinking about the storage piece yet. And so I think that there's an opportunity to recognize, we didn't talk much about jobs and workforce, but there, as we look at net zero, what does it mean? In the United States, so much of the legislation that's passed, I mean, there's a portion that's on carbon management, but a lot of it is like building out the EV fleet in the United States so we can look at decreasing our transportation emissions. It's a lot of renewables build out. And so you can imagine, the fossil dependence is going to shrink to some extent in the United States with all of this clean energy technology being deployed. But at the end of the day, those jobs and that expertise and that knowledge, where is it going to transition? I do think that there's an opportunity for the same workforce, for the same knowledge, to transition to reversing the flow of carbon back into the earth, and I think that's not just true in the United States, that's going to be true in other regions as well. And so again, if we can provide that leadership role in being able to map jobs, and being able to really enable the fossil industry to transition, to be part of this solution, will also, that type of leadership will go in other regions that are not as far along as we are today.
Absolutely. Well, we've got so many more questions. I know we're almost out of time, so I apologize to everyone who we didn't get to. I just wanted to finish by asking one more thing, which is, obviously there's lots of people on this webinar who are really interested in making carbon removal work. What do you think individuals can do or should do if they're interested in making this move forward and kind of getting it done?
Yeah. Well, I would say, learning, reading, talking. If you are passionate and excited about this space, then do everything you can to find your path in it. And I think that there's just so many ways, no matter what your skill set is, that you can play a role. And I feel like the social science piece doesn't get, I've been talking about it a lot, but it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Being able to effectively communicate science and technology is a critical tool. Having more thinkers like this in policy and is another critical piece. I've been trying to recruit people in the government, and we need more, lots more.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox. This has been absolutely amazing and enlightening. Really appreciate you being here. And Toby, I think we're over to you to finish us up.
Yes. Thank you, Megha. And audience, thank you so much for all of the great questions. And again, sorry we couldn't get to them. A couple of housekeeping notes. People have been asking about saving the chat. I unfortunately can't figure out how to do that to allow you to do that, but we can do it on our side, and we will send it when we send the recording to everyone who registered. I want to thank, looks like Dr. Wilcox left, but thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox. This has been amazing. We really appreciate you being with us. We know you're super busy. I put a link in the chat to FECM's upcoming Carbon Management Day on December 1st, which I believe is at a specific time that relates to the atomic weight of carbon.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
1201 on 1201.
Yeah. 1201, right? I think that's great. We on our Twitter, we actually just retweeted a list of the FECM job openings, of which there are many. So I would want to point folks to that as well. But again, Dr. Wilcox, this has really been fantastic to have you with us. It's really an honor, actually. So thank you so much. And thank you for all that you are doing at FECM to advance the sector.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks, everybody.
Couple more quick housekeeping notes. We are continuing to lobby for the federal CDRLA, and we are going to start lobbying for the new state level bills too. In addition to New York, we have Colorado, Massachusetts, and California. So please join OpenAir and help us. We have a set of materials that you can use to contact your local representatives to get them to support these bills. And it's super easy and super impactful. So please help us. That's one of our many projects that we're working on. So would love to get your help specifically with that. Couple of this happened by happenstance to mineralization related. This is CDRs coming up. On November 29th, we have a company called Newstark, which is out of Switzerland, and they are actually delivering some of the highest volumes of long duration CDR on the voluntary carbon markets. And they basically carbonate recycled cement. concrete. Apologies. So it'll be really interesting to hear from them. And then on December 13th, we have another mineralization company that is setting up in situ mineralization systems at direct air capture and carbon capture plants, so that basically the CO2 can be churned into durable minerals that then can be used for industrial purposes, durably storing the CO2. So it'll be exciting to have them as well. And more sessions will be announced soon. Here's a link to the New Stark on November 29th. There's a link in the chat to the This Is CDR Eventbrite collection where you can register for all of the upcoming events. And thank you all for being with us. Everyone be well. And thank you again to Dr. Wilcox for her time today. It was really exciting to hear the update from FECM. Be well and see you soon.